As the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, BBC News has in-depth coverage.
It's very clear the war in this area is extremely active.
This is the site of a Russian missile attack on the eastern edge of Kharkiv.
The Ukrainians have already pushed the Russians out of this city once. The fear is they're going to have to do it again.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app and get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
Welcome to this BBC News special, The Fall of Kabul 1 year on. I'm Yalda Hakim. Hundreds of Taliban fighters gather in Kabul's central square and in other parts of Afghanistan to celebrate the first anniversary of their takeover of the country. But over the past 12 months, the economy has been in freefall. Many girls still can't go to school. And there's a humanitarian crisis, something I've seen firsthand. Everywhere you look in this ward, there's a mother praying, and it feels like that's all they have now. Every baby and child in here is in a critical state, and we just don't know if they're going to make it.
And I'm pleased to set live in Kabul on a day of reflection for Afghans across this country and far beyond, and the profound and for many painful changes of the past year.
I'm Sikandar Kamani, live in Kandahar, the spiritual heartland of the Taliban, and where their ultimate power still resides.
In the next hour, we'll be reflecting on the United States' chaotic exit and examining where Afghanistan stands today, with guests in Kabul and the United States. Welcome to this special program, The Fall of Kabul 1 year on. 12 months ago today, the Taliban took control of the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul. The Western-backed government had collapsed and the world watched in disbelief. It came after a lightning advance across the country by the militant group as it seized province after province from Afghanistan's military. Their victory, the chaotic evacuation of Afghans and foreigners, the images of desperate young men trying to cling to a US military plane taking off from Kabul airport was a moment of reckoning for the West, which had funded and armed the Afghan government. In the next hour, we'll look at what was promised by the Taliban leaders 12 months ago and the state of Afghanistan now. First, let's look back at these pictures from a year ago, which shocked the world. Many Western-backed Afghan government leaders had already fled, while thousands of Afghan citizens and foreigners, fearing Taliban rule, scrambled to find room on flights out. In the next few months, many aspects of life slid towards collapse, with food shortages, power cuts, and with the approaching winter, a humanitarian crisis. I returned to Afghanistan in late 2021 and saw for myself the impact, especially on the youngest of victims, children. When I visited a pediatric ward at a hospital in Kabul, there I saw badly malnourished children with their mothers who had little hope for the future. Here's what I saw.
از کم خوراکی هم است.
یکی از این مریضا که هسته این خانه چیز نداره که یعنی طفلکش سم منظم خوراک و چیز تهیه میکنه بعضی خاطر به میخوره
اینا هم غریبن کلشان غریبن میبینی اما بی غریبن پشت نان پدرشان غریبه به بیرون میگردن اینا هم که بنده خدا سیکو مثل فانک ور گیس کردن کلشان آماس کردن یک ما در روز میشه یه بار من تو خندیده بودم خندیده بعد یواش یواش یکم آرام شدم خوب شد ولی حالی فعلا یکم چشمش واشه
نامه کشه؟
دادی نام چیست جانی؟
منی رحمت
منی رحمت
سنش چند؟ سلوک کن
سلوک کنم؟ چند
Everywhere you look in this ward, there's a mother praying, and it feels like that's all they have now. Every baby and child in here is in a critical state, and we just don't know if they're going to make it. Well, one thing I witnessed going back to Afghanistan at the end of 2021 was the growing threat of the Islamic State in Afghanistan. The rise of a regional affiliate known as ISKP was having a major impact on many people's lives. They were exploiting the poverty and hunger to try and recruit people to challenge the Taliban's authority. We've been called here by the Taliban police who wanted to show us an ISIS sleeper cell that they recently attacked. So what happened here?
د چې کله چاپه والې وه چاپه خو په دا دروازه کې وه صحیح دي یوه سړی چې کوم د دوی سره جنګ وکړي هغه یې په دغه ځای باندې ویشتلی و دلې یې پروت و دلته دوهم سړي خپل ځان ته انفجار ور کړی و ګوره شاوخوا کشنې کشنې ټوټې دا چې دلته په د دیوالو مښتې دي.
Do you have reports of who they were and what their background is?
The investigation is on.
شما وقت یعنی جنگتان خلاص شد فکر کردین که رقم یک چیز باز شروع میشه که داعش پیدا میشه و دی خانه‌های رقم کارا میکنن؟
یک حادثه بود. تصادفاً ما اینطور پیش بینی میکنیم. ولی در همه دنیا همینطور تصادف هست. از ما بهتر میدانید که در همه دنیا همون جایی که شما خیلی امن ترین دنیا را میگین یعنی امریکا، نیویورک، بریتانیا در همون جای چیزایی میایه.
Well, one of the most striking changes in Afghanistan since the Taliban returned to power has been the reversal of the basic rights of women and girls. Girls have been banned from secondary schools. Many women are no longer working and advised to stay in their homes. Afghan women who once held positions of authority across Afghan society have all but disappeared. In the last few days, we have seen women taking to the streets of Kabul to protest. A demonstration that lasted no more than 10 minutes before the Taliban started firing shots to disperse them. Last month, I was in Afghanistan again and heard from a group of women about how they felt. Have a listen.
یعنی بیشتر درک می‌کردم که جایی برای زن‌ها وجود نداره در ایران. باشیم نام سکولار، غرب زده، زن بیدین، کافر و صدها موضوع فساد اخلاقی را به ما وصل می‌کنند. در این جامعه سنتی یعنی مقابله کردن یک شجاعت بسیار بزرگ می‌خواد. همین که فعلا در این شرایط ما آمدیم، همین خودش یک مقابله است. شب بتونم تنها از خانه بیرون بشم. درسته با مخالفت خانواده آنها مقصر نیستن. این شرایط دیده اونا میبینن میترسن. هر لحظه امکان داره بارها استادم کردن. تو بدون محرم کجا میری؟ من یک پدر دارم. اون پدر من میتونه که محرم 4 خواهر ما و مادر ما و به اصطلاح خواهرزادای ما باشه. من خیلی مشکل است که ما برام حالی در خانه بشینم و منتظر باشم که مرا پدرم چی وقت میبره.
Well, while many in Afghanistan say they've lost their freedoms, for the Taliban and their supporters, today is a day of celebration. The Taliban have declared a national holiday to mark 1 year since they seized power. The movement's black and white flags are flying in the main square in the capital, and pickup trucks full of fighters are patrolling the streets. In some areas, the Taliban takeover has been welcomed as marking the end of years of fighting between the Taliban and the former Afghan security forces backed by international troops. Well, over the past year, myself and my colleagues in Afghanistan and correspondent Secunda Kamani and our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette have been following the story. They join me now from Kabul and Kandahar. Thank you both for joining me and for your reporting over not just the last year, but for many years. And Lise, I'm going to come to you first because, of course, you've covered every twist and turn in Afghanistan for more than 3 decades. I just want your assessment of being back in Kabul now a year after the Taliban takeover.
Well, Yalda, who wouldn't welcome among Afghans the end of the attacks by the Taliban, the end of the US-led military campaign, which terrorized many villagers here across this country? But who wouldn't welcome a time of peace? But it's very difficult to call this a time of peace because it's a very uneasy time for so many Afghans. And I have to say, as you mentioned, there have been so many twists and turns in this more than 40-year-long war, but I don't think I've ever seen such a dark tunnel at the end of this particular turn. Afghans had dared to hope that they could believe the Taliban promises as the Taliban advanced towards the capital. The Taliban, as you remember, who said in the Qatari capital Doha that Afghan women would be able to hold any job except perhaps for president. They'd be able to choose their life partner, that girls would have their rights within Islam just like the boys. And what we've seen across this country, and we were able to travel to the Central Highlands, to remote areas. We traveled to the western city of Herat. We've been meeting people here in Kabul, and no matter if they're highly educated, no matter if they're illiterate farmers, they all told us the same thing. They want their girls to be educated just like their boys. We had a fascinating discussion in the Central Highlands where tribal elders in a village as remote as you could get, as poor as you could get in Afghanistan, told us that, well, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, they're progressing, they're Islamic states. We're telling our leaders of the Islamic Emirate that we want to progress too. We want to see changes in our society.
Yeah, and Liz, in the next few minutes, we will be showing that piece to our audience. But let's go to Secunda, who joins us from Kandahar. And Secunda, we're just talking there a little earlier about those flags in Kabul and celebrations, but we're seeing similar celebrations in Kandahar.
Yeah, that's right. We were out in the centre of Kandahar a little earlier today, and there were Taliban fighters, their supporters, driving up and down, parading up and down a main road in the centre of the city, waving the white and black flags, children on board too. The Taliban, as you've said, see this as a celebration of their victory, their struggle against the US-led international presence here in Afghanistan, as well as the Afghan government. They see this as a kind of Independence Day, really, but many other Afghans, even those here in the south of the country, which is generally seen as being much more conservative, where there are large elements of society who are more supportive of the Taliban. There are many people here who are deeply despondent about the future, worried about the trajectory that the country is going in. But as Lise was saying, there are nuances to the situation here. I was in rural Helmand province a few days ago, and I was speaking to people in Sangin district who were terribly affected by the war. They were unable to, even carry out the most basic parts of daily life, going into their fields, for example. And now they felt a sense of relief because the war was over. There was peace for them. Everyone here, whether they're in the cities, whether they're in the villages, even back in Kabul and the north of the country, of course, they're also terribly affected by the economic crisis here. That's one thing that unites Afghans, but there are people, particularly here in the south of the country, particularly in those more rural areas, who are supportive of the Taliban and are glad they've taken control of the country. There are also critics. I spoke to one man who faces the risk of arrest.
We've just lost Secunda. Of course, he's in Kandahar, so the connection isn't great. But that was Secunda Kamani, and of course, we will be speaking to Lise again a little later in the programme. Thank you so much, Lise, for joining us as well. Now, on the day Kabul fell to the Taliban, I was on air while it was happening and hearing from many in the capital who were telling me that they were extremely worried about what their future would look like under the rule of hardline militants. I took a call from the Taliban spokesperson, Sohail Shaheen, who gave these assurances to the Afghan people. Have a listen. Mr. Shaheen, there is a lot of chaos and confusion in Kabul at the moment. Can you just help us understand what the Taliban plan to do at present and next?
Yes, there should not be any confusion in Kabul. We assure the people of Pakistan, particularly in the city of Kabul, that their properties, their lives are safe. There will be no revenge on anyone. The city and the power should be handed over to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and then in future we will have an Afghan inclusive Islamic government in which all Afghans will have participation.
Well, I also asked him whether women's rights would be respected. This was his response.
The policy is that women can have access to education and to work, and of course they will observe the hijab. That's it.
Another thing I asked Sohail Shaheen was whether people who had worked for the Afghan government before the takeover would face retaliation.
In next few days, we want a peaceful transfer. Secondly, the people will resume their normal activity. Thirdly, there is no revenge on all those who were working with the Kabul administration or with the foreign forces.
That was Sohail Shaheen there. Well, that was also August 2021, 15th of August 2021. 7 months later, on the 23rd of March, female students arrived for their start of their school year to find that their classrooms were shut with Taliban guards at the gate. Today, girls older than 12 have been without education for more than a year. My colleague Yalda Limai asked the Taliban spokesperson in Kabul, Zabiullah Mujahid, whether that will change. Have a listen.
Primary schools and universities are open for girls. In some provinces, secondary school students from grade 6 to 12 can go to school. But we have problems in other places. We are trying our best to solve them and to bring things back to normal.
What problems though? Because classes were always segregated for boys and girls even before the 15th of August. So what problem is there in opening the schools?
Our religious scholars have issues with the safety of girls traveling to and from schools. We cannot only make decisions based on the situation in Kabul. We also have to consider villages and districts where people don't want girls to go to school.
It appears there is disagreement within your government on the issue of schools. Where is the opposition coming from specifically?
Education in our country is decided by the people and a body of religious scholars. There have been some problems that have been brought up by those religious scholars. The government is trying to avoid any sort of disagreement with them in order to maintain unity.
That was my colleague Yalda Limai speaking to Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid. Well, let's bring in our guests now. In a moment, we'll talk to former U.S. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch, and Ramiz Alakbarov, the United Nations representative in Kabul. But first, let's speak to Tuba Lutfi, an Afghan activist in Kabul. Tuba John, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. We've been talking a lot about all the changes in Kabul in the last 12 months, but as an Afghan woman living there under Taliban rule, how much has your life changed?
Hello to everyone. Definitely, every woman's life has been changed when the Taliban came to Kabul and took a takeover and Afghanistan fled to Taliban. Definitely, I was the one who was working and in an NGO, and I was free. I was going everywhere. I was teaching. I was a trainer. Then, when the Taliban came, I was in Panjshir province, and I was trying to come to Kabul on 15th, I guess. And on the way, we faced lots of problems, like we had an accident, we could see the war in Jabal Faraj, and we could see firing there in Kapisan and in Bagram. And when we entered to Kabul, everything was changed. And before us, we could see the Taliban, they were in front of us, and they were trying to use the weapons while they were in traffic. So I could see the fear on the face of everyone. and nobody could imagine that this day will happen, and unfortunately we experienced that one.
But 12 months on now, what is the situation for women like you? Are you able to go out of your home? Do you have to cover your face? Just tell us a little bit about your life.
Yes, we have to we have to cover our face. We should not go alone outside, and we can't work. We are jobless, and we can't raise our raise our voice, and we can't we don't have any rights. There is not a process of government. There the schools are banned, and the protesters are being detained, and lots of problems facing a woman. But it's not just women that are facing these problems. Definitely, men are also like this. They are being disappeared, they are being tortured, they are being detained, and so many other things. But without this one, in these days, we are the evidence of disappearing children, especially boys in some places where there is, it's unknown that where these,
Yeah, I mean, you are yourself an activist. You're often protesting in different ways and campaigning. Are you scared for your safety and your future?
Yeah, I do. Scare of my safety, and the best thing we can do in Kabul or in Afghanistan is just changing our places. That's why we are still safe, and I don't know about the tomorrow, and I don't know after 1 second.
Okay, Tuba John, thank you so much for joining us here from Kabul and sharing your thoughts. I know it's not easy, but thank you.
Most welcome.
Now, when the US withdrew from Afghanistan last year, critics said that the United States wouldn't be able to operate counterterrorism effectively. 2 weeks ago, though, the US carried out a drone strike in Kabul, killing the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was a big prize for the United States, and Washington said he'd been living in Afghanistan with the Taliban's knowledge and approval. Well, here's Taliban spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid again on what it means for Taliban-American relations. Have a listen.
Our agreement with the US is still intact. We didn't use Afghan soil against any country. I don't think this will affect our relationship with the world and the US.
It's been at least 10 days since that attack. You still don't know whether the head of Al-Qaeda was in Kabul or not?
The investigation process is time-consuming because it is sensitive and has many aspects. We don't have enough evidence from the scene.
What is the current relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda?
We were unaware of his presence here because there is no relationship. If some people personally had a relationship with him, we will find out. Al-Qaeda doesn't have any members here, as they left Afghanistan long ago.
So just to clarify, the Taliban has no ties with Al-Qaeda?
No, we don't have any ties with Al-Qaeda.
There have been reports and speculation that actually it was members of the Taliban who helped the US identify Ayman al-Zawahiri's location. How do you respond to that?
There is no truth to that.
Well, in a moment, we'll talk to Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch and Ramiz Al-Akbarov, the United Nations representative in Kabul. But first, let's go to former US National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. General McMaster, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. We were just hearing there from Zabihullah Mujahid, who says that the Taliban have no connection or links to Al-Qaeda, despite Ayman al-Zawahiri being found there. Do you believe him?
Of course not, Yalda. I mean, it's time for us to stop listening to these liars, who have inflicted so much suffering on the Afghan people. And I think it's time to end our self-delusion. I mean, I can't believe even your own reporting, from Sangin, that people are better off. I mean, it's unbelievable the degree to which we are deluding ourselves about Afghanistan still, a year after the disastrous surrender and withdrawal from Kabul.
Yeah, I mean, for you, I just want you to reflect because you served in Afghanistan. I know it is somewhere that you care about and have often think about and did as National Security Advisor. You tried to shift and change the policy towards the country. I mean, 1 year after the takeover, it must be hard for you to absorb 20 years of international efforts and $1 trillion spent, and the Taliban are back in power.
Well, it's not, because really we were inept across those 20 years. And it was not a 20-year war. It was a 1-year war fought 20 times over, and there were a series of inconsistent and fundamentally flawed strategies. And what's astounding to me is even after we've seen the return of the Taliban and the horrors that they've inflicted again on the Afghan people, we're still deluding ourselves. Oh, there's no relationship with Al-Qaeda. I mean, really? Okay, we just found Ayman al-Zawahiri in living in the Sherpur district of Kabul in one of Suraj Haqqani's houses. Women are going to be. It's going to be a much more benign form of Sharia, and women will have rights. I mean, how's that working out? I mean, it's astounding to me, Yalda, that we continue to delude ourselves about the nature of the Taliban. And, I think we have to recognize, as we look at this, right, a year after the fall of Kabul, why did Kabul fall? It fell because we defeated ourselves, and we delivered blow after psychological blow to the Afghan government and security forces. I mean, really, when you look at it, from the February 2020 surrender document that the Trump administration signed, to the disastrous withdrawal in August of last year, we were essentially partnering with the Taliban against the Afghan government and security forces.
But that Afghan government, General McMaster, was corrupt and inept, and it had a whole host of its own problems.
Yeah, right. So who do you prefer, right? I mean, do you prefer the Taliban government? Of course, Afghanistan had not become Denmark, Yalda, right? But it didn't need to be Denmark. It needed to be on a path toward reform over time, with sustained commitment, conditionality of assistance, all sorts of mechanisms we could have used to continue to incentivize the necessary reforms in Afghanistan. But look at what you have now. I mean, the current head of the Afghan government, or the Taliban government, encouraged his teenage son to commit mass murder by suicide. Right? And then we deluded ourselves to think that that's going to be better. I mean, who do you prefer, him or Ashraf Ghani?
You do have U.S. intelligence at the weekend saying that actually the Taliban, under the Taliban, Al-Qaeda is not regrouping. Do you believe that intelligence?
Of course not. Look at the UN intel reports. Look at really previous reports where our intelligence said, "Oh, the Al-Qaeda is not very active in Afghanistan, and there is really no presence." Do you remember the Shorbak Farms raid in December of 2015 when we uncovered the largest Al-Qaeda training camp that we've ever encountered, run by the Taliban, and we had no idea it was there? I mean, it's ridiculous to assume that they're not completely intertwined, because we have all sorts of evidence to the contrary. I mean, it was Ayman al-Zawahiri who had pledged bayat multiple times to multiple Taliban leaders. These are groups that are intertwined and share expertise, and they share funding. I mean, Suraj Haqqani, who's now the Minister of Interior in Afghanistan, was the main bridge between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And we keep romanticizing, Yalda, the Taliban is some sort of semi-virtuous, like, rural movement. This is a transnational terrorist organization which is interconnected with others, and is a creature of support from the Pakistan's ISI as well.
It is now in power, General McMaster, and how do you propose that the United States now deal, and the administration now deal with the Taliban?
I don't think you do. I mean, I think you isolate that government, and you do everything you can to try to get some assistance to the Afghan people. But we should give zero support, zero legitimacy to a terrorist organization that's running a country, because we're in a dangerous situation, Yalda, whether we want to believe it or not. Suraj Haqqani is issuing passports to terrorists. I mean, I think we ought to go back to a year from today. Look at the images of the unit that took over the Kabul airport. That was an Al-Qaeda brigade within the Taliban. We have to wake up and realize the reality of the situation we're dealing with.
General McMaster, how do you see this situation unfolding over the next, say, 2 years?
Well, the Taliban cannot govern, right? They're not going to be able to govern effectively. It'll be an ongoing humanitarian crisis, which is going to become a security crisis associated with refugees leaving the country and really making worse this terrorist ecosystem that exists along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. There are going to be attacks beyond that area that are going to, I think, compel us to become more active militarily to disrupt terrorist organizations that already exist there. Right? We're talking about the connection between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but there are over 20 U.S. designated terrorist organizations that reside in this terrorist ecosystem between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
General McMaster, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you, Yalda.
Now, as we've been reporting, the humanitarian situation is dire for millions of Afghans. Human Rights Watch has been documenting abuses under the Taliban in the past year. In its most recent report, it says the Taliban have broken multiple pledges to respect human rights and women's rights, suppressed media, and arbitrarily detained, tortured, and executed its critics. Well, Heather Barr is the Associate Director of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Heather, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. You and I have been speaking for a year about this, almost on a regular basis, but you're just listening there to General McMaster and Tuba Lutfi, and women's rights activist. I mean, this is quite a grim assessment of the situation on the ground.
That's right. And I mean, what Tuba described, that matches our research exactly. I think she said we have no rights, and that's a fair description of the situation for Afghan women today. And, you know, General McMaster and I, we know each other from our days in Afghanistan, and we haven't always agreed on everything, but I certainly share his sense of kind of disbelief and frustration that the international community has allowed things to reach this point for the Afghan people, particularly women and girls.
I mean, you wrote a letter today to Afghan women and girls, and you started off by saying, I'm sorry that the United States and the international community have let you down. And one thing that I continue to hear from Afghan women and girls, and I know that you do too, is they ask, have we been forgotten? Does anyone care? And if they do, what are they prepared to do?
Yeah, I mean, we've been so disappointed and frustrated. I mean, perhaps we shouldn't be disappointed because we shouldn't have expected anything else. But by the world's reaction, beginning on August 15th and up until and including today, I think, you know, we've seen so many statements of deep concern, condemnation. Clearly, every country in the world thinks that, for example, banning girls from secondary school is outrageous and beyond the pale. But all of that adds up to almost nothing in terms of concrete actions. I mean, there are a couple things that we're trying to push for in the coming month or two. One is there should be a complete end to travel ban exemptions for Taliban leaders. The Security Council should not only remove those exemptions, but also look for new additional people who should be added to the travel ban list. And then the Human Rights Council needs to be doing much more to ensure that there's real monitoring of human rights violations and real accountability for those violations. That is just not in place at the moment.
Other than the travel ban, I mean, what else do you propose?
So there are mechanisms that can monitor a human rights crisis. There are fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiry that have been ordered in other countries. And that's what we need from the Human Rights Council at this point. We need a serious, well-resourced, large team of people whose job it is to collect evidence and preserve that evidence so that the crimes that are being committed in Afghanistan right now, including against women and girls, can result in prosecutions.
Tell me a little bit more about what women and girls are telling you, because of course there are now secret schools in the country. People are looking for other means and ways in which they can educate themselves. But life in the country right now for them is incredibly difficult.
So women and girls are resisting, as they always have, as they did from 1996 to 2001. We see that in the underground schools. We see that in the protesters who risked their lives to come out on the streets again on Saturday. But we have to not fool ourselves that underground schools can replace a functioning school system. We have to recognize that this is an unprecedented situation, except to the extent that it's similar to what happened from 1996 to 2001 when the Taliban were last in power. And we have to ask, what is going on that the world is ready to tolerate this and kind of, shrug its shoulders and say, well, that's an awful shame. Too bad I can't do anything.
Heather, thank you very much for joining us here a year after the Taliban took control of Afghanistan.
Thanks for all your work, Yalda.
Since the takeover, Afghanistan's economy has nearly collapsed before NATO and US troops left and the Afghan government was ousted. 45% of the country's economy came from foreign aid and 90% of Afghans lived on an income of less than $2 a day. Let's go live now to Kabul, and Ramiz Alakbarov is the United Nations Secretary General's Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramiz, for joining us here on the programme. It does feel in many ways, and would you say it's fair to say, that Afghanistan is in survival mode?
Thank you, Yalda, for having me today. And indeed, it has been a difficult year for the people of Afghanistan. They were in survival mode. Half of the population were on the brink of starvation this winter. And thanks to efforts of our partners and World Food Program, UNICEF, FAO, the winter was saved and largely starvation was avoided. But right now, 19 plus million people are in malnutrition stage, and more than 6 million people are actually in acute malnutrition or IPC4 stage. So it remains very difficult.
How do you assess the Taliban's transition from insurgency to government? Are they showing that they understand what it means to run a country of 40 million, and to get the economy back into a position where it's not on the verge of collapse? And I know a lot of that has to do with the fact that they face sanctions and the foreign funds are frozen. But the Taliban themselves, do they have the ability to govern?
Well, you recently have been here and we had this discussion. So when we look at the de facto authorities, their attention was on border revenue collection and on supporting private sector as the mode of recovery and growth. As the result of it, they were able to formulate a $3 billion budget, out of which $1 billion is a deficit. Now, let's look at the other side. We used to have a $15.5 billion budget. Right now, there is also any sectoral development plan for any of the social sector areas, and there is any sort of the national development plan which would guide any concerted effort in this area. If you add to this that we have no idea how this $2 billion budget or $3 billion, if they raise it, budget is structured, that leads you to a conclusion where the planning for the sector or specifically for the social development sector stands.
It feels in many ways as though poverty, extreme poverty, has replaced the security concerns that the country once faced.
I agree with you. We are talking about chronically half of the population, about 20 million people, in constant need of some sort of support, either nutritional or other essential basic life needs support. And you can look at it from that perspective. Either you keep feeding 20 million people, or you go for a bottom-up growth, you focus on the villages, you focus on the farmers, and you try to create 2 or 3 million jobs so that the people start feeding themselves. But let's not make a mistake, Yalda. Without recovery of economy, without functional banking system, there is no future, and Afghanistan will not move from surviving to any sort of thriving, and that's the current situation.
Do you think, Dr. Ramiz, the international community is putting enough pressure on the Taliban? Because girls are still not going to school. Women have been pushed completely out of the public eye. You heard there from General McMaster's assessment, as well as Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch, a very grim assessment, as well as the women who are there in Kabul, across Afghanistan. You meet with them often, you hear their stories.
Absolutely. Afghanistan is a very complex place. It is located at the heart of Asia. It has always had quite a vibrant economic relationship with its own neighbors, which are at the people's level. It also has a very diverse context in which it exists economically and geopolitically. When it comes to the ways of working with the current authorities, we at the UN maintain a very strong advocacy. For us, women's rights, the issues of girls going back to school is not something we trade about or we discuss. This is non-negotiable. And this has been a very consistent message we have given to them. And as a result of it, let's face it, today, the aid sector of Afghanistan could have benefited from much stronger support of international community, but it is not having the same level of support. Reasons are very clear, and the issues of women's rights, and specifically women's education, women's access to jobs, and all what we hear around women is very central and absolutely essential for the resolution of the crisis around Afghanistan.
Dr. Ramiz, thank you so much for joining us here on this special.
Thank you for having me.
Now we'll have more on the economy with the Asia Pacific Director at the UN Development Programme in the next few minutes. But first, let's go back to Kabul now and speak to our Chief International Correspondent, Lise Doucette, who joins us from there. And Lise, of course, you are also in Kabul. You've been going back and forth over the last year. You've seen the dire humanitarian crisis as well and witnessed it.
Yes, as you say, Yalda, it is the concerns over this deepening humanitarian crisis that seem to have replaced security as the uppermost concern. I met a young wheat farmer, 18 years old, a labourer in the central province of Gore, remote, poor, and he said the battle against poverty and famine was even bigger than the battle of gunfights. Young men and women struggling to find work, struggling to support their families. In a moment, we'll bring you the report from the Central Highlands and what we saw after 3 years of punishing drought in Gore province. But first, let's turn to the issue that has dominated public perceptions of the Taliban's harsh rule, and that is the treatment of women and girls. So many women pushed out of prominent positions in Afghan society. We're joined here by Naila Mirza, who is a doctor and also a women's rights activist. Naila, a day for reflection. How would you describe the mood among educated women who are still here in Kabul?
Okay, first of all, I want to tell about all those educated women and girls who are imprisoned in their homes and are not able to get out of their homes or get back to their jobs. Because this, I personally believe that this government are highly afraid of educated women. They have banned the schools and they have banned the universities for a reason. After a few years, we won't have female leaders in this country, which we need very much. We won't have female doctors, we won't have female journalists. They are I personally feel that they are against education. They are against knowledge and they are very, very afraid of the women in power. The knowledge is like light in this society, in this community. We need that to fight against the terrorism. But it's completely clear that why this group has banned the knowledge for only girls. They have enough budget for war. They have enough budget for the bullets, but they somehow can't manage for the girls' education and for the girls, going back to their schools, going back to their jobs and universities. I don't know why they are ignoring all those women who want their lives, their normal lives back.
And as a doctor, you would appreciate that a year for women staying home rather than going to work, a year for young Afghan women not going to school. There's concerns about mental health. A number of aid agencies have expressed concern about. UN Women told us about their concern that they're hearing many reports of attempted suicides. Just how does the pressure manifest itself?
I personally think that after all the suppressions, after all the oppressions, okay, fine, we live in a conservative society, but that does not mean that Afghans don't like or don't want or don't appreciate the knowledge. When they ban all the schools for girls or jobs for women or universities for girls, for other girls, of course, this is the normal thing to happen. We have seen the suicide cases in the hospital. We have seen suicide attempts in the hospital. hospital, and that's quite normal. This is what happens when they try to oppress and suppress the women in the society. And I highly can see that the women, educated ones, are trying to find a way to get out of the country, and uneducated ones are hiding behind marriages. And this is what is going to happen when a country is deprived of the education, such important issue that we should all talk about. And I don't know why worldwide international community is still silent about this. They should have take action against this. They are torturing Afghan women, they are torturing Afghan girls just because they are against knowledge. And I've seen that Afghanistan has become a playground for their politics. It's misusing the name of Islam, it's misusing the name of, politics. They are playing, and they are playing because their own personal benefits with the future, with the country's future.
Briefly, have you have any hope left?
It's a very depressive situation for me, that I should say that I should still have hope. But when I see the patients, when I see the people outside, when I see the women getting tortured because of their gender, simply because you're a woman, you can't. They don't consider you equal enough as men. So I want to still have hope, but sometimes it looks very, very impossible to still have hope with this government, because this government does not seem like a normal government. This government does not seem like a government who is with people. It looks much more that these people are these soldiers are against people. They are using people for their own benefits, for getting recognized.
Dr. Naila Mirza Saleh, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us with your very strong views on the pressures on Afghan women, but you can sense there the determination of Afghan women to keep fighting. And when Afghans are fighting, both men and women, they are fighting for many families. It's a hand-to-mouth existence. We've traveled to the province of Ghor in the central highlands of Afghanistan, one of the poorest, now suffering multiple crises. This is Chagcharan. It means a place where people eat dry straw. The name given a half-century ago in memory of a punishing drought. It's still written into this life, this land. Now the people of these central highlands are again living and dying in drought. 3 years of it. Kushk is what you hear. Kushk means dry. Look at the wheat. The land is dry. The rivers are dry. There's not even snow on these stunning mountains. And look at the faces of these men. They've lived for decades with drought, with poverty, but nothing like they're seeing this year. Salam, salam, salam. And the world's crises have come to their door. Climate change is to blame. The conflict in Ukraine means fertilizer is scarce, prices high.
Nothing is green. We can't farm. We don't have anything. We can't grow our wheat.
Ow? Ast? Khushk, it's dry. It's dry. We travelled with the British charity Afghan Aid. It's been working here for many years. They brought drought-resistant wheat. It's not enough.
This year is the most severe and worst year in comparison to every year that we have been working here because of the drought, climate change. If that continues, there is a fear, but we should not allow to go to that situation that people are died because of not having food.
The greatest fear, famine. There's already been signs of it this year in this province. The day we visit the only malnutrition clinic, there are nearly 40 patients, only 10 beds. Sigbatullah is 15 months old. His mother died giving birth.
It is a bad situation. It is worse than Yemen.
It's worse than Yemen?
Than Yemen, yeah. The main problem is the poor situation of the people. Poverty is leading cause of this kind of illness.
Poverty. The economy all but collapsed when the Taliban took over. The West stopped aid to their government, froze their assets. These are the men in charge here, the provincial cabinet. Taliban governor Ahmed Shah Dindost fought in the long war which ended last August. He tells me he was imprisoned, tortured by US forces. For him, this war isn't over.
The prison time hurt my pride. I will keep fighting until I am dead. I am not tired of fighting and I don't like peace.
Younger, educated members of his team seem to take a different tack as the Taliban struggle to move from guns to government.
The most important thing is the condition of the people, then the worsening economic condition of Afghanistan. The health crisis which is affecting Afghanistan right now needs attention and doesn't need to involve politics. We have to save people's lives.
In a midsummer harvest, thoughts already turn to winter. What if humanitarian aid dries up and the Taliban don't do more for their people? A people who renamed their provincial capital. Not Chakcharan, eaters of dry straw, but Firozko, for their unshakable mountains, standing up to adversity, but searching for help.
That was Lise Doucette reporting on the humanitarian situation in Ghor. Well, a year on, this is what the Afghan economy looks like. The UN Development Programme estimates the country's GDP contracted by 20% since the Taliban's takeover. Per capita income has plummeted, while prices of essentials are up by 35%. And an estimated 700,000 jobs have been lost since this date a year ago. Well, for more on this, let's go live to New York now. And Kani Wignaraja is Asia Pacific Director of the United Nations Development Programme. Kani, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. It's been a year since the Taliban took over. We've just read some statistics there and the impact on the economy. But I just want your reflections and observations.
Well, you're very right, Yalda. I think in 6 months, the first 6 months of Taliban takeover, we saw an economic crash that we haven't seen anywhere in the world. It took, in Syria, it took 6 years for that level of crash to be seen. So when you see almost all Afghans getting rapidly poorer, we are stuck with saying, well, here's another winter coming on, and can we again go into a cycle of relief? And my read of all of these economic factors and this harsh, deep poverty is we've got to break this cycle and do something very different in this country.
It does feel like, Kani, that this is kind of almost like a Band-Aid approach, from one winter to the next, just trying to resolve the crisis at hand rather than trying to sort of deal with this collapsed economy. Help our audiences understand why this sudden crash and collapse that you talk about. Some of the reasons, because you talk about it took Syria 6 years. Why did it virtually happen overnight in Afghanistan?
Well, Afghanistan was a much smaller economy to start with, right? We're talking about a $20 billion economy pre-Taliban takeover for 40 million people. If you just look at a comparator, Poland, same number of people, $420 billion economy. So when it crashes, I mean, you're taking the bottom out of a very fragile economy that had been so heavily dependent on foreign aid. So this is something that we've all got to, as an international community, look at and see what can be done very differently, because it's a very costly operation to keep trying to put a relief operation in a place where you need to jumpstart local microeconomies. Afghanistan has never been a national economy. It has always been a series of microeconomies. So you've got to go in with saying, can we jumpstart the domestic markets, localized markets, and people's jobs and their livelihoods in the locations they are, and hope that that really resuscitates and really pushes back a huge war on poverty, which is what it is.
And Kani, just also explain the impact of women being pushed out of the public eye on the economy and in general on Afghan society.
Well, you know, UNDP has estimated that of those 700,000 jobs lost, the majority of that was women's work. Where they were either told no more coming into work or these jobs are now for men. That's about $1 billion loss to the economy. So a 5% GDP contraction just on that alone. No country can grow, even prosper, without women coming back to work. So just keeping them on the books and saying, well, we are continuing to pay them, which is a pittance of the salary they used to get, this is not going to do it. So for us as a UN, it is absolutely essential that we keep the pressure on, but we are asking the whole international community to keep the pressure on getting women back to full employment and getting girls back to school. To me, those two are essential if the country is to be governed and to get out of this situation it is in right now.
Kani Wignaraja, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you, Yalda.
Now, after the Taliban takeover of the country, terror attacks claimed by the Islamic State of Khorasan Province, or ISKP, have been on the rise. Militants claimed the huge attack on Kabul airport in August last year that killed more than 175 people. ISKP is an offshoot of the violent Islamic group that calls itself the Islamic State. It was formed in 2014 by breakaway fighters of the Pakistan Taliban and Afghan fighters who pledged allegiance to the late IS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Well, Afghan journalist Fazil Munallah Kazizai is the correspondent for the magazine New Lines. He has recently interviewed leaders of the Islamic State of Khorasan province, and he joins me now. Thank you very much, Fazil, for joining us here on the programme. You've been researching ISKP's presence in Afghanistan for many, many years. I just want your assessment of the threat from ISK today.
Thanks. Let me clarify that the study and the investigation was done by me and Kassans, and we both carry out the interviews and the investigation on the ground. Yes, as you know better, that after the fall of Kabul in last year, the only threat which Afghan face, especially some sectarian minorities like Sufis and Shia, and the Taliban, is from the Daesh or ISKP. ISKP is right now the only big threat for the security, for the safety of locals, and also for the Taliban.
But Fazil, this is something that the Taliban choose to downplay. I went on a number of ISKP raids on their sleeper cells, and the Taliban say this is a minor issue and they're trying to resolve it.
Yes, the Taliban are trying to, do not show it as it is, but the truth is that the only threat which is made everyone worried, including the Taliban, is ISKP. And ISKP, compared to the time that they were, ruling a piece of lands in the eastern parts of Afghanistan, are much bigger, much stronger, much more equipped with strong exclusive that make, big news here in the country and also out of the country. So if I'm honest, the ISKP of Daesh is a big threat, and everyone should acknowledge that.
And just very briefly, would you say it is fair to say that the Taliban have become the new Ghani government and ISKP have become the new Taliban? It's almost like a vicious cycle.
No, I'm not agree with that, because the Taliban are backed by strong Islamic ideologue all over the Islamic world. The Taliban are backed by a massive number of scholars in Afghanistan. They have a religious base and religious backup inside the country and also in the Islamic world. But the Ghani government did not have that. Yes, I can say that the ISKP right now is the only threat to the Taliban, as you know, previously the Taliban was the same threat to the Republic government. But the Taliban are much stronger, much better
than the previous government.
The basis of the previous government.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time here, Fazil, but thank you so much for your investigation and for joining us, and our audience can read that online. That's it from me and our guests here for this BBC special programme. Stay with us, we've got General Petraeus coming up in the next few minutes.